shrink. You can go to a dietitian. You can go to a trainer. Sometimes if we need entities, combined. Diet is.
Yeah, it's all intrinsically linked. That's interesting because it's all linked physically, like in our bodies. But I think it is. We try to like separate that. No, like exactly. I'll go see a psychiatrist or a therapist, and then I'll go see a nutritionist. And while those things all have their value and their place, the brain, all of it is connected to the same body. So there's a lot of, we can probably get it at the source.
Yeah, I agree. I'm listening to you here. Just
no worries. I'm
making the miracle happen of
fascinated.
podcasting. So, and
there we are.
Just like that. Hello, everyone. We're live for the world. So live for everyone to see.
Cool.
Hopefully
this is my good side.
This is your good side. I did have someone on the podcast that said, "Oh, the camera's over there. I don't like that. That's my bad side." I was like, "Well, I could hold the camera."
It's your good side today.
It is your good side. It's going to be your best side today. So, well, Emma, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I've already had a great conversation with you prior to this, and I feel like the audience probably should have been able to get into that. That was like the impromptu, but I guess
warm-up.
That's my special treat. But for the rest of the world, thank you for joining us, Emma, and being willing to come on and share your story on the Origins Life podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Coming from California, you flew out here.
I did.
For the podcast. Which is a special privilege for me, that you'd be willing to go through all that.
Yeah, you know what? It was an easy flight.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of screaming children, but other than that, it was great.
All right. Well, this is the 20th episode.
Oh.
You are number 20.
I'm like a landmark.
This is like a special occasion. So we had to fly someone in from California.
You had to.
Yes.
For the 20th.
Yes, it's great. So, Emma, I think you're aware of what the purpose of the Origins Life podcast is. It's really designed to kind of help us understand our story, but then yet relate to the bigger human story that we're all a part of.
Right.
But we always like to start at the beginning, and we start from our upbringing as we try to make sense of our existence. So let's start from there.
Well, I was born and raised in Santa Barbara, California, and I actually didn't realize how amazing of a place that was until I left and went to college. And so it was then coming back for summer break and winter break I was like, I grew up here. This is incredible. But I was born and raised there, and my mom was born and raised in Santa Barbara, California as well. So I do have like a lot of history. We went to the same high school in Santa Barbara, and my grandparents actually came to Santa Barbara, I think in like the 50s. So my grandpa's Welsh and my grandma's Canadian, and they came over and they bought 2 houses, and he was a chemistry professor at UCSB. So I actually live in the house that my mom grew up in, and my grandparents live in another house that they've owned for a while. So I have a lot of roots in Santa Barbara now that I think about it.
Yeah. Santa Barbara is a beautiful place.
It is. It really is. It's incredible. Like I said, I didn't really realize until I left. Growing up, it was so normal after class, after school, we would like, oh, let's go to the beach for a couple hours, and then we'll go do homework. And you don't realize how much of a luxury that is until you move somewhere where there's no beach.
Right.
So I was shocked that I was like, I grew up here. It's such a different lens coming back to it. But I'm so thankful to come from Santa Barbara.
Yes.
Yeah.
Living out here in the desert. It is just barren. There's no color. There's a lot of people that live out here in Vegas that come from California, and I ask them, how'd you do that?
That's a huge transition. I think that there is a luxury in desert beauty that we're not used to in Santa Barbara. I mean, even like last night, the sunset and the silhouettes, I was like, this is also beautiful. I forget it during the day because it's so hot.
Yes. Yeah, the running joke is that, everyone says that the heat here is a dry heat. It's like, it's not dry when you're sweating.
It's like you create your own humidity bubble, right?
Right.
Yeah.
This cloud of humidity produced by my sweat. So let's talk about your childhood, though. You've talked a little bit about your background and, where you were raised, but your parents' influences and those things. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my dad was born and raised in Bakersfield, and he came to Santa Barbara to play baseball at Westmont, which is a really small religious college in Santa Barbara. And my parents actually met. My mom was doing grant writing for a nonprofit organization that has since closed, and my dad was the director of the local Boys and Girls Club. So they met I didn't realize until I wanted to be more involved in the not-for-profit world. I was like, that's a really cool way to meet. But they met and they were married very soon after they met. And when I was really young, they got divorced when I was, I think, about 2.5. And so all of my life, I just know my parents as being divorced. And my dad remarried by the time I was 5. And I have 2 little brothers, Dallas and Mason, they're not little anymore, but they're little to me. So at that point, I don't know if you're familiar with the Southern California area, but my dad and my brothers and my stepmom moved to Ventura and then Oxnard. So my life was always centered around Santa Barbara, but I commuted a lot. So because there was a 50-50 custody agreement. So I went to private school growing up, which was amazing. I went to 2 different private schools in the Santa Barbara area, which I didn't realize until I got older that it's a huge luxury. But my dad is Black and my mom is white, and that actually had a huge impact growing up for me in the Santa Barbara area. I, my entire life, moved through the world as a woman of color. I identified as Black, and my mom, being a white woman, was super, had no problems. I have a couple friends with white moms and Black dads, and there's, been contention, especially as we move into adulthood and our identities are challenged, especially by the current political climate. There is a lot of identity, wrapped up in race. And so I have always identified as Black. And as actually when I got to college that that kind of changed. I had to realign that because there were a lot of people that were like, well, your mom is white, so are you Black? And so, obviously long histories of one drop rule and being Black in America. But that played a huge role in my upbringing because, like I said, I went to private school. And so I was definitely a minority. There's, I think, about maybe 1 or 2 Black kids in each grade, and that might be being really generous with that. So that had a huge impact on my upbringing. From a really young age, my dad was always like, you're a woman of color and the world is going to see you that way. So you're going to have obstacles that other people don't have. And it's interesting. I actually, my original plan after graduation was I was going to study overseas. So up until a couple weeks ago, I was actually fully committed to get my Master's of Science at the University of Bristol. And in my personal statement, I actually talked about on the way to 2nd grade picture day, my dad sitting me down on the car ride to school because we were commuting and being like, you're Black and the world is going to see you that way and you're going to have it harder because of that. And it's interesting, the gravity of that conversation with an 8-year-old, which was, so those moments were really pivotal for me in my upbringing looking back.
He was really trying to prepare you for the world that he knew.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think, what's so difficult is it has changed. And I don't think that racism is any weaker. I think it just has taken a really different course. And so him explaining that to me obviously was coming from his own experience, and being a man of color obviously in America is really different than being a woman of color. And being as it's called, being a light-skinned woman of color is also a very, very different identity and viewpoint. And so I definitely, looking back, appreciated those conversations and appreciated my ability to also have the same conversations with my mom, which was really instrumental in me being able to carve my own path for my identity. Both of them being such big factors in helping me understand that identity.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
What was your mom's influence in kind of helping you understand your ethnicity?
Growing up, my mom was so supportive. One main memory I have is in 8th grade is when I really started to feel the weight of it, because my hair was short and super duper curly and coarse, and I wanted to chemically straighten it. And my mom said, I love you, and I know that I want you to feel beautiful, but I can't let you do it. And of course I was so mad. But looking back, my mom did such an incredible job at just being a safe space and not encroaching and trying to explain to me about my own identity moving through the world as a woman of color. So really it was that I could go to my mom with anything and she would listen, and if I asked for advice, she would give it. But it really just a sounding board and a place that I could go to about any topic that I needed to, whether it be about race or not. And so, yeah, my parents kind of had a really great, they were divorced, but they had this great push and pull kind of relationship where my dad was doing a lot of the very active, instilling agency as a woman of color, where my mom also was then a wonderful space for me to go and kind of just decompress and kind of digest that, mull it over. Yes. So it was a great dynamic that I didn't, they didn't really talk very much. The divorce was, it wasn't perfect, what is, but they had this wonderful dynamic, even not being super communicative with one another, that I look back and I'm like, I had some really great parents. So it worked out really well.
That they were able to kind of balance that and still keep you as the focal point.
Yeah, definitely.
A lot of times kids get lost in that.
And I never, like I said, divorce is like, it's never easy. And, it was hard growing up because, small kids be like, oh, like those aren't your brothers because that's not your mom. And, my mom and my dad and my stepmom were all very much like, these are your brothers and this is family. And so even though they didn't talk, there was an amazing balance. And I just always knew that no matter what, like my parents loved me, I was going to be provided for, I was going to have an education. And I think those are the things that are most important because no family is perfect. But if you come from somewhere where you know that people are going to support you and love you and make sure that you're cared for, whatever that means for you and your family, that I think was so important for me growing up.
Yeah, it's great that they kept the focus of preparing you for life. So many times when things are difficult, we just get kind of mired in our own problems that we kind of lose sight of the bigger picture, which your parents obviously did a great job in preparing you for your life. So let's tell the audience about your high school years because obviously being younger, you're 22?
I'm 23.
23, okay. So obviously the high school years are very formative for you in really setting the direction for the course that you're on currently. So tell us a little bit about those experiences. Yeah,
so I think there was probably 2,500 kids in my high school, and there was a very small amount of us that were Black, obviously. That had some hardships. There was a lot of instances, even looking back, that I didn't realize I'm dumbfounded now looking back that I could keep composure. I had so many questions like, if you're Black, like, why do you have freckles? And I didn't even know how to answer some of these questions at the time. I had a lot of white friends that were amazing people, but there was a veil, between an understanding of me being a woman of color and, rap music. I definitely think has its place, but really kind of colloquializes the N-word. And so that was an uphill battle for me in high school and trying to explain to friends that like I just didn't feel comfortable with them using that. I'm like trying to explain like hundreds of years of racial power dynamics in this country in 30 seconds to sum up why I don't want you to say that to me. So there was definitely experiences that felt a little bit ostracizing and were really difficult to work through and explain succinctly and, calmly that I wasn't really comfortable with how some of my friends treated me and, talked to me. I did have a couple really close Black friends that we could, I don't want to say commiserate, but we could definitely communicate and talk about these issues within our friend group. But in Santa Barbara, I was just always considered Black. It was Emma, the Black girl, or that group of friends, and the Black girl, Emma, which was not a problem. And it definitely wasn't meant as like a slam. But again, like I said, I always kind of come back to identity politics and these grouping of people. And so that was definitely my identity in high school, and a lot of confusion because at that time my stepmom and my dad had gotten divorced, and my brothers were living with my stepmom. And I was living with my mom. And so people didn't see, my dad everywhere all the time. And so there was a lot of confusion about like, well, Emma's mom is white, but she's Black. And just so much like misunderstanding and confusion about my race and my color and my background and my upbringing. So like I said, it was definitely instrumental, but I didn't ever really let it affect me in high school. I think I became a lot more fragile when I got to college. But I think that also comes with, when ignorance is bliss. So I didn't have a huge grasp in high school of politics or social justice. And so I didn't know sometimes if my complaints were like had merit. I was like, maybe this is just how it is growing up. This is how racial dynamics are. But I learned quickly that it didn't have to be like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your upbringing really kind of set the table for your discovery or your pursuit of trying to kind of work through these things.
Absolutely.
A lot of people are born into environments where they don't really, they don't have the space or the means or even the reason to kind of try to fight for their space.
Right.
They're just born into homogeny or, into an environment that's all the same.
Yeah.
And they don't know what different is, and they just kind of go throughout their day in a somewhat of a mindless state.
Absolutely.
Or maybe mindless is the wrong word, but in a state where they're not really having to think about the bigger picture.
Right.
But you're being born into an environment where every single day you're having to consider these things and trying to, in a bigger sense, fight for your space. But then you're also identifying your struggle with other struggle that's going on with people around you in similar situations of color, growing up in environments of predominantly white culture.
Right. And this is all at the same time that, we all are trying to carve our own path in other ways. So, while you're grappling with race, or exactly like looking around and seeing a really homogenous demographic, which Santa Barbara very much is, while you're trying to chart and understand that, there are, you're moving through the world also trying to understand womanhood and, coming of age, preparing for college, family dynamics. I mean, everything else, tests and classes and, who said what. And so there's so many other layers, which I think, we were talking earlier, talking about the education system and like reform that I'd really like to see is that we're all students in high school or in college. And then there are so many other things on top of that that we're grappling with and trying to work through and understand at the same time. And so there was, it's all obviously intercombined and all comes from I'm all the same person. So working through all of those things simultaneously, sometimes racial discussions with friends did take a back seat because of the fact that I have a AP World test on Tuesday. You know what I mean? So
yes. There was moments of gravity, but it's still at the same time, you didn't forfeit your childhood to figure out all the world problems.
Right.
But
right.
Yet you had a healthy balance of personal awareness, social awareness, but yet you still could be a kid.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Absolutely.
Great. That's amazing.
Yeah.
A lot of times, I think that those experiences can maybe steer people into maybe a little bit more of a jaded perspective, but it's amazing that you're able to see these things, and from the little bit I know of you, it hasn't poisoned your spirit. It really actually, I think it's actually enlivened you and given you even a more vibrant, loving disposition, which is great.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to think so.
Absolutely. It comes across very, very obvious.
Thank you.
If I could just interject, growing up in Omaha, Nebraska, I'm almost 37. I was under the impression as a child,
Mm-hmm.
not any longer, but as a child, that racism is over. We had desegregation. Hey, look, everything's great. And with the recent election of Donald Trump and all of the fallout from that, it's amazing the conversations that are being had now. Like, this guy is just bringing stuff up to the surface, where during the campaign, there was a lot of talk about racism and how it was it was woven into the fabric of who we are as people. And I remember listening to those things and several years ago thinking, do I really contribute to it? And as I started exposing myself to the other side and allowing my whiteness to be examined,
right,
and the privilege I've been given, and I started to see through the evaluation of others that all of us have within us some tendencies that can gravitate towards bigotry and racism and just superior type of viewpoint. So it's amazing that in the culture that we have right now, that there are still some people that could even listen to this and say racism is over. What are you talking about? But for you, you're seeing it as a younger person, and you're saying, yeah, it's still alive, and we still have work to do. So for someone that's in it and knows about it, they're saying, yeah, absolutely. And for someone that's watching this or listening, they're saying, I thought that was all fixed in the 60s.
Right.
It's
right.
not.
And that's something that I've encountered so much. And the demographic is like believing that racism is over is not actually homogenous. It's not just what we saw in the recent election. It's not just middle America, white evangelicals that we can point to and say, well, they think racism's over. I mean, not at all. I mean, you can talk to anyone of any background at anywhere, and there are people that will argue that, because redlining is no longer happening, or because the Little Rock Five integrated the school system, that we do not have racism in America. And, I think we discussed this earlier. To me, it's just reared a different head, and we just see it really differently. And I think that we're actually seeing a more upfront targeting of a wider demographic. I mean, you had a different type of racism, yes, in the 60s and the 70s. But even avid lovers of, like avid Democrats, we've had some problematic Democrats in office also. And so I think what's interesting about that is that we've had a tendency to say, oh, it's the Trump administration and they're just racist, and Republicans and the GOP and they're just racist. And what we're seeing is that that is not the case at all. I mean, you can have someone sitting next to you that exactly has even an element of bigotry and, you know, has a predisposition in their mind to not like someone of color. And I think that we see that really, really adamantly also in police brutality and shooting. And there's a lot of justification surrounding that that I think really elicits that for the rest of us to see.
Yes. And I think what you see right now is you can look at the situation, you can say it's getting worse, or you can say it's getting better. And I always say it depends on where you look. Mm-hmm. Now, in one case, this could be getting worse, but in the same case, maybe that's what it takes to fix it. And I'm not saying that there's that we want to see anyone get hurt or anything, but when you see the situation in our country right now, I think it causes alarm for good reason. But then sometimes I think it causes us to become paralyzed with this idea that it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. But yet there's people like you and others who are seeing it for what it is and saying, what can we do about it? So maybe that's a good segue or a good transition into what you're doing now. And given your background, given your experiences, given your desire to make a change, tell us about your current pursuits.
Yeah, so I just graduated from UC Davis, which is super exciting. And I also at the same time simultaneously wrapped up my track career. So I was running track, which was an amazing experience, absolutely. And a lot of people are you so sad that it's over? And I'm not, because it was an amazing experience. I started as a walk-on, so I achieved 110% more than I thought I ever could. I didn't even think I was going to make the team. And it was great. I ended as a 3-year captain and a full scholarship athlete. So that was definitely, I look back and I think that is speaks to, you know, my determination moving forward. Hopefully I can carry some of that with me. So I have just graduated, which is really exciting. And like I said previously, I had completely committed to getting my master's in a university in England, and my course sort of shifted. I spent almost the entire year marginalizing so many other things in pursuit of this perfect application, and have since decided that I'm going to take a different route. So as of right now, I have a couple options that I'm weighing out, a couple job offers that I still want to get a master's. So trying to balance those things. But moving forward, looking further down the line, law school is definitely something that has I think been my dream since like second grade. And so that is definitely in the future. And I really would like I've told you, really want to hold public office. I think that I spent a long time in really like kind of gritty social justice work and had this sort of like contempt, you know, for America and this lacking in patriotism, because I equated patriotism with the Trump administration. Like, that's what patriotism is. And, you know, what I found is that I think I have so many critiques of the system and global capitalism and imperialism. Yes. But what I realized is that underneath that, I think is actually like a deep found love for, you know, the country that I grew up in and understanding the freedoms that I was granted in this country as a woman of color. Not even granted, but something that people before me had fought for, that I was like, I want to continue that. I want to be the next person that can continue this forward momentum for more women, more people of color, anybody to have a better life in America. So without sounding too preachy, that's really what I would like to do eventually. To hold a Senate seat is the dream, you know, and then the bigger dream is Secretary of State, because I was an international relations major and I love discussing foreign policy. So you know, they're big dreams and they're lofty, but they're by no means impossible. And the more that we're seeing women running and holding seats in office, the more empowering it is. Like, that can be me and I can do that. And so that's, you guys said, what am I doing now? That's not exactly what I'm doing, but that's everything I'm doing is kind of in pursuit of that. So even individual projects, you know, like constant trying to stay so informed about what is going on in the world. And I've done a little bit of backtracking, and I've done a lot of like more history research on my own to, you know, better understand workings and institutions today. So that's kind of where I see myself moving. And right now I am a little bit in a holding pattern, which is a blessing, because being busy can be stressful. So I'm trying to just embrace, as of right now, you know, I am an unemployed college graduate. So like add that to the American demographic
Put
mix.
that on the resume.
Yeah. But other than that, I'm trying to figure it out as I go. But I really would like to do something that would help set me up for that. So I'm still in Davis, finishing out my lease, and I'm kind of trying to see if I can infiltrate the Capitol. It's right there. So I think, originally I wanted to go back to Santa Barbara when I found out I wasn't going to England, but I think that it would be best for me to stay near the Capitol and see what I can do. The closest I've really been was the Women's March, and that is not close enough. I have to be inside. So that's kind of the direction that I'm heading now. But like I said, there's like a period of holding happening, but I'm comfortable with it. It's okay.
So I'm getting you before you're famous.
You're getting me, so I can't say anything too incriminating now.
Yeah.
But
that's great. It's sad because in our culture, sometimes the least qualified people end up in probably the most influential positions. Or if they're qualified, their disposition, their demeanor disqualifies them. Sometimes the most qualified people are discouraged from the system because they just feel like it's too much of a mess. I'm not even going to deal with it. I'll just go over here and enjoy my life. You're seeing the mess and you're saying, I'm pulling up my sleeves and I'm going to do something about it.
I want to run straight to it. And I think, unfortunately, that has a trickle-down effect, and I'm seeing that largely with my own peers. It's overwhelming. So California had its primaries in the midterm elections in early June, and I know maybe one person my age who voted, and it was too confusing. It was too difficult to navigate, and I was not as informed as I wanted to be going into the polls, and I spent, I had time on my hands, but I spent a good couple of hours like really vetting, as getting as much information as I could before I went to the polls, and that's something that I think our education system needs to have. Like, we want to have people voting, we want to have them at the polls, but no one is going. And it's, I try to galvanize people in my peer group. A lot of my friends were on the track team, and so a lot of us are women of color, and I'm like, 100 years ago, we would have been denied at the polls. And I'm not saying that we should go just because of that, but this is a freedom that is novel in a lot of ways. And that's where I keep coming back to. We need a stronger educational system, even at the university level. There needs to be some sort of education about getting people to vote. And we're just not seeing it. And so I think that trickles down in so many other ways. It's discouraging. So not only are qualified people not running for office, but we're seeing like people who are college educated, so smart and so passionate about what they're doing and passionate about where they live, and marginalized identities who would like to see a change in how their country is treating them. And there's just not enough education about it. So then they're also discouraged. And then, we're seeing that also at the high school level and even below that about, can I go to college? I don't know if I don't have the money, so therefore I can't go, without informing people of the resources. And so many qualified people who are we need in these systems, and we need to have them influencing the system, are feeling discouraged. And that's one of the things that it has to change, because I've had the luxury of having time on my hands. I was a 5th year senior this year because I was injured my freshman year. So my last quarter, once track was over, I only had one class the whole quarter. So I had time once track was over to do all of this research and figure it out. But student athletes, students in general, they don't have the time to dig into this and even understand like the 3 branches of separation of government, what that means, how it works, where it doesn't work, what needs to change. So like I said, I know I'm getting preachy, but again, just that trickle down effect is, yes, we're not seeing the people in office, but we're also not seeing the representation anywhere else. So that's what has to change somehow.
Now, you identify as a millennial in your age group. What are some of the maybe misconceptions that people have about millennials that you're trying to right? My grandpa was a really harsh critic because, my grandparents aren't citizens. They have green cards, and so they don't vote, but have a lot of opinions, which it's funny how that works. But they were very, very, very confused about the Bernie Sanders campaign and how that could work. And, unfortunately, socialism has a really nasty connotation in this country. Thank you, Cold War. But that was really scary, I think, for a lot of older generations who really actually, and my grandparents did, right? They capitalized on the American dream. And what we don't realize is that doesn't work for everybody. There are systems in place that makes the American dream capable for some and not others. And so being a millennial, some of the misconceptions is exactly kind of like this conflation with socialist sort of Bernie Sanders, which I don't think is a bad thing, but that's one thing I think that we're too radical, we're too concerned with social justice, which is
easy to say when you've made it, or you're not part of a demographic that is marginalized, or you don't feel penalized for the color of your skin or your gender or your sexual orientation or your ability. And so I think that's one thing I've noticed about critiques of millennials, is that we're too rebellious. It's too much of a rebel without a cause. And I think that that's a great thing. I think that if more people were like that, we would see more change, because it's galvanizing, right? So you hear someone talking about injustice, and it's hard if, to not listen, even if you don't agree, even if you think that that's blasphemy. It's hard to tune it out. And so that's one thing that gets to me. And I was trying, my grandparents, I call them grandma and grandpa in Welsh, because my grandpa is Welsh. And so I was like, Ty, do you have to, listen, you have to, and it's too rebellious. It's not conservative enough. And I think that is what can change moving forward, is that there's some wiggle room. And I think that the American political parties could use that, a little loosening up, loosening the tie a little bit.
So I'm going to ask a couple questions. Okay. The two-party system, and then socialism versus capitalism. So I guess the first question, socialism and capitalism, I think we're often given this idea that you choose one or the other. That it's either you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which is the religion of white people, or it's socialism, which is in general sense it's viewed as the minority opinion. So, so how in our culture do we even begin to get away from this socialism capitalism stuff? And then I think it ties into the two-party system of Democrat Republican. Can you kind of help make sense of some of that? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, I can try. Yeah. So capitalism is my favorite subject to discuss, because oh man, there's just so much to talk about. So, obviously Industrial Revolution, we really see the rise of capitalism. And, I found it in my bookshelf. I guess I had it, but I just finished Weber's Protestant Reformation and the rise of labor and capitalism. And, I don't really believe in the whole proletariat. Let's burn everything to the ground. But I also just finished Marx and the Communist Manifesto, and I'm trying to tackle Lenin's latest work, one of his most famous, about how imperialism is the highest form of capitalism. And so, obviously looking at those things, it's hard sometimes when we think of socialism and communism, we really go back to this turn of the century Industrial Revolution sort of image of communism or socialism, which is void of inclusion of people of color, right? So sometimes it almost feels hard to apply. We did obviously see during the civil rights movement, lots of black women were being excluded. It was kind of a misogynistic movement on all fronts, anywhere between Martin Luther King Jr. to Malcolm X to the Black Panthers. And so we did see a lot of black women during that time turning to communism and socialism and the American Communist Party. So that's kind of always where I go back to, is understanding, sort of trying to make sense of where it could fit in today, by understanding that, during Marx's time, it was really a different question to tackle. Capitalism was really different. And so when we look at imperialism, we see global capitalism on every front, and it's actually been conflated with democracy, freedom, liberty. I mean, most famously, the, invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and how it was this idea that, the occupation of Iraq was going to bring freedom and liberty to these poor, impoverished, brown, barbaric people.
Nation building.
Right. In the name of enlightenment and liberty. Yes. And so, of course, and then all of that, comes back to America's founding, Bill of Rights, everything. We see all of that tied in, French Revolution, everything. So I think, when we look at capitalism versus socialism, it's so hard not to get kind of caught up, more honestly, in my opinion, in this Cold War era viewpoint, and this idea that communism is scary and it's bad, and this is, we're looking at Soviet Union occupying the world and taking over North Korea. And so I'm getting way down the rabbit hole, but
bread lines and
yes. Exactly. And I think that unfortunately anything that's welfare state, people see as communism, and then therefore socialism is bad. So my biggest critique of capitalism is that it just does a really good job at marginalizing minorities. And unfortunately, that's also kind of inherently in democracy, right? So even, you have a majority of people, and the minorities are always, even if it's just an ideological minority, they get marginalized because it's based on the masses, which, these things are so intermarried that it's so hard to extrapolate them, that then it kind of, to me, it just has started to rear its ugly head, and we see in imperialism, and how imperialism and capitalism working together have fundamentally been able to deny anybody who isn't like a cis het white male gets really, really, really trampled on by the system. And unfortunately, socialism, I really don't identify as like a pure socialist, because of the fact I think if you put all means of production into state hands, I don't think we can trust that the state is not going to be corrupt in that. And I think we also see this theme in a lot of dystopian novels, right? You see kind of like a socialist thing occurring in like fiction and sci-fi novels after like the fall of the government. And you have, even Hunger Games, you have somebody in control who's super corrupt, and you still have a vertical chain of command in socialism. So I really hope that we could, someone somewhere, I hope it's not me, find something in between where we don't have to have capitalism, but we don't have to have, kind of the scary version of socialism, which I don't think this country could, or any country really at this point, could do perfectly without corruption. So it's a hard question.
Yes.
It is.
So how do we move from fighting to collaboration? So how do, because so much of the environment right now is still very toxic, and again, I give you that question in a way because the division that's happening right now between red and blue and conservative and liberal, it just seems like the conversations that are being had force people into one or the other, and I think there's a middle space that has to be created. And how do we do that? Because otherwise, it just goes back to the default.
One of my favorite classes at Davis was Political Science 51, where we looked at party polarization and, whether the masses follow political elites or whether political elites change their positions on things and follow the masses. And that really got me thinking. I really don't believe in party polarization. I think that it's a really, like you said, it's a dangerous tool. I think when we look at Maine and we look at their rank voting choice, that does a little bit of a better job at kind of like massaging the system, relaxing it a little bit. I think personally that it takes a little bit away from this very, very distinct red and blue. But it's so hard because we see, so many demographics feeling like they have to go one way. I mean, so many black voters register as Democrat, and then Republicans get the name of being, like I said, like GOP members. And there's so much gray area in these like very polar identities. And the Electoral College is also another reason that so many people my age don't want to vote. They feel like their voice doesn't matter. And, if you try to say, oh, well, if you move to a swing state, it matters, or in other elections, it matters, they think presidency. And so it is probably not going to happen, but I think we would have to move away from the Electoral College. I think that it makes people feel marginalized, and then it makes you feel like you have to pick. I was having a conversation with a friend the other day, and I was, explaining to him that when I run, I'm going to run as a Democrat. I guess let everyone know I'm registered as a Democrat. And he was like, no, like run as an independent, like change this whole system. And, the sad part of the system is that it's really hard to make it as an independent. And I felt, as a woman of color and, potentially being on the younger side when I move into this, I think it would be really hard to make it as an independent. I think I would be posited as maybe too liberal or too radical. And it would be kind of like that whole millennial thing coming back to haunt me. So the only way, I think, I would love to change Electoral College, but, I think we're going to see the founding of this nation, like really an iron grip on the U.S. Constitution. So maybe not that, but I also think that media outlets do a really terrible job at this, and they create a really polar and polarizing force for the American people that makes it really difficult, like we were discussing earlier, to seed out what information is accurate. The running joke is, you know who you're with if Fox News is on, right? And that's such a hard thing because there's probably a lot of merit in people who are CNN supporters and watching something from Fox and just understanding where, maybe a more conservative viewpoint is coming from and vice versa. And so I think, since we probably will not be able to dismantle the Electoral College, and which does a really good job at dividing these parties, I think it will really come from us being more informed voters and people, and understanding this party polarization is working in favor of elites. It doesn't help us. It doesn't help the rest of the masses, but it does help posit very bipartisan ideas on things that don't have to be. And I think immigration and the current stands around immigration really show us that I don't think immigration has to be bipartisan, because we did see deportation in the Obama administration, and it did not have the same salience as it does right now. Obviously, very, very, very different rhetoric and very, very, very different court rulings and decisions. But at the same time, immigration is going to come whether you're an independent or a Republican or a Democrat. So it doesn't have to be labeled with a party, and it has been. And so how to dismantle that? Being more informed, I think, being able to make more of your own decisions. I know so many people that just refuse to hear another standpoint. And that's what I think is so great about what you're doing, is bringing these people together with so many different viewpoints, because there's so much to learn from someone just explaining something from their standpoint in a non-aggressive front. So that's like a really non-committal answer of being like, the people have to do more. But if we could find more way to like vest more power in people and choice, I think that we would have such a more profound outcome in not having these harsh distinctions between red and blue. I do not think that there's anything wrong with people having a difference of opinion, but I do think there is something wrong with this polar idea of blue and red.
Yes. You know, my perspective from this too is with the advent of social media and really just technology as a whole. I'm old enough to remember times without computers and without cell phones and all these things. I remember when my dad brought home our first computer, it was this MS-DOS, and you had to have all these commands, and you had to memorize the commands to get to the right drive, to get to the little like archaic game that we could play on. And, you know, so our world, and that was in the 80s. You know, so a person's perspective in the 80s was just basically what they heard on one of the 3 channels and what they were told from their parents and maybe a couple things they read in their books.
Right.
But your generation is the first generation in human history where you can reach out and touch and do and have access to anything that's unheard of. And I think sometimes we never stop even to consider that. We just automatically go to the problem right now, but we fail to realize is that the current generations coming up are being privy and given access and perspectives that thousands of generations would never even dreamed of having.
Yeah.
So just that simple addition of technology is just changing the conversation in a drastic way.
Absolutely.
And I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that as a great thing, because now people are being empowered to make those changes that they can do within their realm.
Right. And we even see political discourse changing entirely with our current president. And, you know, a lot of his policy is carried out through Twitter, which is, you know, presidents since, Twitter was founded, like they do have Twitters and they tweet, but we're like, I mean, I read an article the other day. It is completely changing the face of political discourse in this country. Yeah. It's flipping it on its head. I mean, things like foreign policy is being dictated by a tweet, and it's dumbfounding. And I've noticed like a lot of like older generations are really uncomfortable with it. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think social media has done a lot of good to colloquialize the conversation. So there is access to this information instantaneously because tweets are just there all of a sudden. So I think that, it hasn't been it is hard because then you have a lot of opinions, right? So you're like sifting through comments, and you can have, really like obscene comments about something, that someone otherwise would have had to just like tell their circle of people, but now thousands of people on the internet are seeing it. But then also you can look at it as a galvanizing and unifying force, because you could have someone who's had two people have two very different opinions, and their comments are right on top of each other. And so maybe it would work for, the masses or young people to come to that and maybe be able to find themselves falling somewhere in between. So I don't think it's a bad thing that it is changing the nature of political discourse. I think it's okay.
Good. I'm a Gen Xer, and I'm kind of like right there at the threshold. But my primary influence was baby boomers. And obviously you're coming from a different perspective too, and it's interesting because just in that dynamic of traditionalism, it's hard for us to recognize perspectives given the time frame in which people were raised. And so much of the argument just becomes polarized just because we have no ability to be able to relate to the previous generations and then kind of equally chart a new path forward. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in intergenerational work to really allow these conversations to be had. But what's very indicative of the baby boomers is they never deal with anything.
Right.
Like I'm not picking on my parents. Okay. All right. Okay. This isn't a pick on my parents show. But when I see the tendencies of that generation, that's just again my influence. Baby boomers, they would rather, and this is again, I grew up in the Midwest,
right,
in a white conservative place. So things would go unresolved for your whole life. Like you would not dare bring that thing out because you know it's going to start World War III in your home. Right. So you would just bury this stuff and you wouldn't deal with it. But now we have a new generation that says, hey, what's that over there? And the old generation is saying, don't look at that.
Cover it up, right?
Don't look at that. So how do we get these intergenerational work going? And the easy answer is they'll die, right?
Right.
Now, I'm not trying to be rude, but
right.
sometimes just new blood is very healthy. And sometimes I think we also need to keep in check that give it enough time and you'll have new people, right?
Yeah.
But yet, honoring the past, embracing the new, how do we bring these two generational components together in a way that actually creates productivity?
What you were saying is like so much of what I've seen in like my grandparents' generation, and there's so much practice of what you're saying, kind of just like shoving it somewhere in a corner. And, that was kind of part of the difficult conversation and explaining to my grandparents, like change is good and millennials, we're radical, but that doesn't have to be negative. That doesn't have to be something that we run from or are afraid of. I think that sometimes radical is so synonymous with like liberal, and like people I think like Vietnam War protests, which also is not a bad thing. Yes. But I don't think that radical is bad. And so I think this intermingling of the generations is just going to have to continually come from seeing this intermingling everywhere. So when we see, like I was talking about earlier, we saw Ocasio-Cortez win the Democratic seat in the 14th Congressional District of New York. It's super important because she's now going to, if she wins the spot, she's going to be moving on and like intermingling in a field, in a circle that is very much of an older generation has a really older perspective. And so I think it's just going to take more representation and intermingling at all levels, everything down to school teachers and job diversity. I think it's really just going to take that crossover, which is obviously really easy in urban areas, right? So when you look at the coasts, and you see super urbanized areas, you have to, right? That's migration. You see so much diversity in people. And I feel like it would be really difficult in the Midwest, where sometimes like the next house I think is pretty far down the road. And so, I think we just need to keep intermingling and getting people to cross over. And social media has done that. And I think, can continue to do that for the older generations that are on it. It's a hard question because it's kind of a utopian idea to think of older and newer generations, joining hands and being able to understand one another. But I think that it could be done with just more intermingling and more movement of these younger generations into positions of power.
Yes. I see questions or the use of questions as being a powerful tool in really having some conversations because a lot of times I think what we're doing is we're making accusations against the other person. Yeah. And then we're not actually creating and provoking thought in the other. I think question has a very powerful component in this dynamic because if you ask someone to articulate why they believe what they believe, it causes them to evaluate at a core level why they believe this. But if you make this statement, well, you believe this because you're wrong, then it's defensive, and then we don't get anywhere, and then they just label each other and they walk away all ticked off.
And then you have this like horrible image in your head of what a Republican is and what an independent is and what a Democrat is or what a black person is, and it's exactly. It's so damaging, and it is difficult sometimes to move into a conversation and not be defensive or not just try to push your own agenda. I think, my mom told me, when people talk like really, because I get kind of combative sometimes when we talk politics, and, just being able to hear her tell me like, don't listen to respond, which I think is what happens. Like someone saying something and it triggers something and then you kind of harp on that and then you're ready to respond to it versus just being able to like let them finish the thought and the conversation moves not with your like predetermined agenda, which is hard. And I think it might have been on CNN. We saw the other, we do this. They do this all the time with political analysts and they have panels and they all just kind of like end up talking over each other. And then the only thing that really stands out is when someone says like, you're out of your cotton picking mind. And then like the internet is ablaze with criticizing the racist foundations of this country, which is valid and justified. Yes. But then, the larger conversation is lost.
Good point.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's like shiny thing. A squirrel. Hey, what were we talking about?
Right, exactly.
So how do we restore the humanity? How do we get back to, because the human element is the only thing that's going to repair this. So how do we, and I know it's a big question, but what are some of the practical things that the everyday person can do to restore the humanity that's necessary for bridging these difficult subjects?
It does place a lot of agency in the individual, but I think it's about finding a way to be involved, which is kind of, I think, like a hackneyed and overused, just be involved, get involved. It's hard. I understand for the average working American, you have a 9 to 5 and you have kids to take care of and you have a mortgage to pay. And there's a lot that has to be done before you can, take to the streets, but in protest. But I think that so much of it is changing our involvement and finding ways for younger generations to have a seat at the table and to be included. It's so hard. And I've noticed myself when there's like gaps in like understanding. So if someone brings, something about the Dow Jones to the table, that is a dark spot for me and something that I've been trying to work on and understanding a lot better and like more intrinsically, like having a better grasp on that. But I think that we need to like educate one another and like being able to admit like, I don't know what you just said or what that means. Like more conversation, more individual agency and finding the answers to these questions, figuring out what it is we don't know and how we can change that. I think it's so important. It's so important. And I know, again, it's probably so overused, but to get younger people more educated and more involved to the polls with opinions, wanting to hold public office, wanting to be part of this American system, because many of us will remain American citizens. We will stay in this republic and we will continue to criticize it and want to change it. And that's a beautiful thing. And I don't think that we have to shy away from that. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying some people really, this is the greatest republic in the world. It has some of the most freedoms compared to any other country in the world for all people. And it's far from perfect. So continuing to get people involved and galvanize about this turnover and changing that. Again, I always come back to it's going to take a change in this like prison industrial complex, military industrial complex, flawed education system. All of that is going to have to change. But if we just get more involved and we care more about it and we're okay with being the radical millennials, I think that is a really great starting point. It's not easy and you'll never have this perfect utopian 100% voter turnout, but I think that that's something that we should keep in, as like the city on the hill image to keep moving towards.
It's great. How do you stay grounded?
It's a really great question. It's really hard not to just get in this like running news cycle and like flipping the channels between like Fox, CNN, MSNBC, CBS News, whatever else is out there. I have stayed running. So I wake up every morning at around like 5:45 or 6, have a cup of coffee or tea, and then I'll go for like a 3-mile run, which is usually when I listen to the Life Origins podcast, Origins Life. And then reading fiction novels helps a lot. That I found that really takes me out of it. And it's hard because you're thinking at that time, okay, well, I could be learning more about reading this history text that I bought, but anything that's self-fulfilling, I think, is so important for a time out of the day. Running is that for me. I mean, I only run like 3 miles a day, so my mom is an ultra marathoner and has done like 50 milers, so she'll text me like, oh, I'm going out for like 16 miles today, and I'm like, oh, have fun. But and like for me, anything self-fulfilling. So even sometimes I'll know like I have a little bit of extra money in my wallet, so I'll make sure that I bike downtown. And just that break and maybe like listening to music or, that like 5-minute break of biking downtown is enough time to kind of like regroup and then, read my novel for an hour and then maybe go back to it. Because, every time you put your phone down, you flip it back over. I don't know if you get news alerts to your phone, but there's like 100 things that have happened in the last hour that you've been engrossed in a fiction novel. So for me, it's just like those little things of self-fulfillment. I have great roommates right now. So sometimes we'll just like lay on the couch and watch Bob's Burgers. And that's also like a good grounding. Also close to family has helped a lot.
It's great that you have that, because if you don't have it now, you're not going to finally just discover it when you're 40.
Right.
And usually by then, the damage is already done physically. It's just amazing how it just wears the body. They're starting to learn and discover all the ways in which it damages us. But it's very encouraging to me to see someone who's so energetic, so empathic, so vibrant, so involved, but yet at the same time balanced and grounded. It's truly
you.
amazing. So you got my vote. You
Yeah.
moved to Nevada.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. I'll make sure to refer everybody back to this as like the 23-year-old Congresswoman Emma.
Which is, to me, honestly, I have no idea, neither of us know where life will take you.
Right.
But for me to be able to just interact with you and to share your story with a small part of the world is truly a privilege of mine.
Thank you.
And I'm very, very grateful. So in the last few minutes, I want to hear maybe just some closing thoughts from you, maybe some perspective or some final thoughts you'd like to leave with the audience.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Man, that's a lot to think about. But I think your question, like the best question of the day, was really like balance and finding that, and how do you do that? Because, it's so easy to get caught up in that and into one thing, no matter what it is, like whether it be politics or your job. Being a student athlete really helped with that, because you're forced to balance and time manage. And I understand that that's not an opportunity that everybody has, or that's not everybody's passion. But I think just like finding really small things that are like, that restore you back to homeostasis, because things can really start to push and pull you in every direction, and you're like so far from your center of self. There's days that you wake up and it's like part of the human condition, like you're not in a great mood, or things are stressful, or you're feeling down, or you're struggling with something in your life. And I think finding those like really small, like for me, I love decaf coffee because I can drink as much of it as I want. But, for me, it is like, going to like a coffee shop and like just ordering like a decaf coffee and reading or working on a project there. Or, and just listening to music, like just the small things that like bring you back to center are so important, because I think so many of us lose like sometimes the human aspect because we're so caught up in politics or in social justice reform or our jobs or our kids or, any other thing that we're confronted with. And I think that being able to just find a way to come back to your center. For some people, it's meditation, and prayer. Some people, it's exercise, being with friends, spending time alone, whatever it is. I think that is like the most important thing. And I think that would actually help a lot of politicians if there was like this built-in time to like come back to center. And so that is really what like I like to try to share, not in a way that's like, I don't want to be condescending, be like, this is what you should do, and I'm a life coach, but really moving forward, it's helped me so much. It's just, I'm not an artist, but like sometimes I like to like bring out the paints and paint, because it's just time that doesn't have to, we're so caught up in this capitalist idea of productivity and being productive. And sometimes even like reading books, you're like, oh, look how many pages I've read today. And it's just so innate in us and in this system. So to be able to take the time and be like kind of free of time almost is a luxury that if you have it or you can build it into your schedule, I understand not everybody can, but is so important.
It's great. So in order to fix humanity, we have to rediscover our own.
I could not agree more.
It's great. So Emma, thank you so much. I wish we had more time.
Yeah, thank you.
We're going to have to have you back on again sometime.
I'm ready.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Am I still rolling?
I'm just giving them here the
Okay.
last sound here. They can't see us, or they can hear us, and I'll turn this one up.
All right. I survived.
You survived. You made it. Goodbye, everyone.